The stagecoach rattled into Holbrook, Arizona territory, on a scorching afternoon in June 1882. Carrying among its dust-covered passengers a young woman whose elegant traveling dress marked her as distinctly out of place in this frontier town. Rose Zimmerman pressed her gloved hand against the window, watching the rough wooden building slide past with a mixture of apprehension and determination. At 22 years old, she had left behind everything familiar in Philadelphia to answer an advertisement for a mail-order bride, desperate to escape a life that had become unbearable after her father's business partner had tried to force her into marriage to settle a fabricated debt. The man waiting for her, a rancher named Samuel Morton, had written 3 letters that seemed kind enough, though she suspected he would be sorely disappointed when he discovered the truth about her complete lack of domestic skills. The stagecoach lurched to a halt outside the depot, and Rose gathered her carpetbag and small trunk, her heart hammering against her ribcage. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times during the long journey west, rehearsing what she would say, how she would explain that the woman he expected and the woman she actually was were 2 entirely different people. But when she stepped down onto the wooden platform, scanning the handful of men waiting there, none of them stepped forward to claim her. She waited as the other passengers dispersed, as the driver unloaded luggage and mail, as the afternoon sun beat down relentlessly on her already aching head. Samuel Morton did not appear. After an hour of waiting, Rose finally approached the depot manager, a grizzled man with kind eyes who introduced himself as Chester Hayes. "I'm looking for Samuel Morton," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I was supposed to meet him here." Chester's expression shifted to something like pity mixed with discomfort. "Madam, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but Sam Morton passed on about 3 weeks ago. Snake bite while he was out checking fence lines. Happened real quick, they said. Didn't suffer much." The words hit Rose like a physical blow. She swayed slightly, gripping her carpetbag tighter. Dead. The man she had traveled 2,000 miles to marry was dead, and she was stranded in a town where she knew no one, with barely enough money to survive a week, let alone book passage back east. "I see," she managed to say, though her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Thank you for telling me." "There's a boarding house just down the street," Chester offered gently. "Mrs. Patterson runs a decent place, not too expensive." Rose nodded numbly and picked up her trunk, struggling with its weight as she made her way down the dusty main street. The boarding house was easy enough to find, a 2-story structure that looked slightly more maintained than its neighbors. Mrs. Patterson, a stout woman with flour dusted on her apron, took one look at Rose's face and seemed to understand immediately that something had gone terribly wrong. "Mail order bride for Sam Morton?" she asked bluntly. Rose could only nod. "Poor dear. Come in, come in. I'll get you settled. First 3 nights are on the house until you figure out what you're going to do." The kindness nearly undid Rose completely, but she held herself together as she followed Mrs. Patterson upstairs to a small but clean room. Once alone, she sat on the narrow bed and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to feel the full weight of her situation before forcing herself to think practically. She needed work, needed it desperately, but what could she do? She had been raised as a gentleman's daughter, educated in literature and music and art, utterly unprepared for any kind of practical labor. That evening at dinner, served family style in the boarding house's dining room, Rose found herself seated across from a young woman named Lucy who worked at the general store, and next to a weathered cowboy named Tom who worked at one of the nearby ranches. The conversation flowed around her as she picked at her food, trying to formulate some kind of plan. "You hear that Isaac Richardson is looking to hire someone," Lucy said to Tom between bites of beef stew. "His housekeeper quit last week, ran off with that traveling salesman. Left him in quite a bind." "Isaac can afford to be in a bind," Tom replied with a chuckle. "Man's got the most successful ranch in the territory. He'll find someone soon enough." Rose's head snapped up. "This Mr. Richardson, he's looking for a housekeeper." Lucy turned to her with interest. "That's right. You looking for work? I should warn you, Isaac's place is about 10 miles outside town. Beautiful ranch, but it's a fair distance. He comes into town every week or so for supplies, but otherwise, you'd be pretty isolated out there." "That doesn't concern me," Rose said quickly. "How would I contact him about the position? He usually comes in on Saturdays for supplies. That's tomorrow. You could probably catch him at the general store mid-morning." Rose felt the first flicker of hope since arriving in Holbrook. A housekeeper position would provide room and board and a small salary. She conveniently pushed aside the minor detail that she had no idea how to keep house, no idea how to cook or clean or do any of the things a frontier housekeeper would need to know. She would figure it out. She had to. The next morning, Rose dressed in her most practical traveling outfit and made her way to the general store just after 9. The building was larger than most on the main street, packed with everything from farm equipment to bolts of fabric. Lucy greeted her warmly from behind the counter and pointed toward a tall man examining a display of rope near the back. "That's Isaac Richardson," she whispered. "Good luck." Rose approached slowly, using the moment to observe him. He was perhaps 28 or 29, tall and lean with the kind of build that came from hard physical work. His hair was dark, curling slightly at the collar of his shirt, and his face was tanned from long hours in the sun. When he turned and caught sight of her approaching, his eyes, a startling shade of gray-blue, regarded her with curiosity. "Mr. Richardson?" Rose asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "That's right." His voice was deep, with a slight drawl that marked him as having lived in the West for some time. "Can I help you with something, madam? I heard you're looking for a housekeeper. I'd like to apply for the position." Isaac looked her up and down, not in an impolite way, but with the assessing gaze of someone sizing up a potential employee. Rose was acutely aware of how out of place she must look, how obviously Eastern and refined. "You new in town?" he asked. "I arrived yesterday. I came to marry Samuel Morton, but I learned he passed away recently. I need work, and I'm willing to work hard." Something shifted in Isaac's expression, a softening around his eyes. "Sam was a good man." "I'm sorry for your loss, though I suppose you didn't know him well enough for it to be a true loss in the usual sense." He paused, still studying her. "Have you kept house before?" This was the moment. Rose could lie, could fabricate experience she didn't have, but something about Isaac Richardson's direct gaze made her want to tell the truth. "No," she admitted. "I haven't. I was raised in Philadelphia. My father was a merchant and we had servants. I can read and write and keep accounts, but I have no practical experience with housekeeping or cooking or any of the things you probably need." She expected him to dismiss her immediately, to turn back to his rope and forget she existed. Instead, Isaac continued to study her with that same thoughtful expression. "Why tell me the truth? You could have lied. Because you'd find out soon enough, and then I'd be back where I started. At least this way, you know what you're getting or not getting, as the case may be." A smile tugged at the corner of Isaac's mouth. "That's fair reasoning. Tell me, Miss Zimmerman, Rose Zimmerman. Tell me, Miss Zimmerman, why come out here at all if you're not suited for frontier life?" Rose met his eyes steadily. "Because the alternative was worse. Sometimes you don't choose the life you can handle easily. You choose the life you can live with." Isaac was quiet for a long moment, and Rose was certain he was formulating a polite rejection. Then he surprised her completely. "I live alone on my ranch, have for 3 years since my mother passed. I built the place up from nothing and it's doing well now, but I'll be honest with you, the house is a disaster. My housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, kept everything running smooth, but since she left, I've been eating burned beans and sleeping in the same sheets for 2 weeks because I can't seem to find the time to wash them and run the ranch at the same time." "I understand," Rose said, though she wasn't quite sure where he was going with this. "The thing is," Isaac continued, "I don't actually need someone who already knows how to do everything. I need someone willing to learn, someone reliable who'll stick around. The West has a way of teaching people what they need to know, if they're willing to put in the effort. My mother used to say that any fool could learn to cook if they were hungry enough and had enough patience to fail a few times first." Rose felt her heart begin to race with something that might have been hope. "Are you offering me the position? I'm considering it, but I need to know if you're serious about staying. A lot of Eastern ladies come out here thinking it'll be an adventure and then head back home at the first sign of real hardship. My ranch is 10 miles from town. It's isolated. The work is hard. The heat in summer is brutal, and the winters get cold. There are rattlesnakes and scorpions and occasionally bandits passing through. It's not an easy life. Mr. Richardson, I left Philadelphia with no intention of ever returning. I have nowhere else to go and no one to go back to. If you're willing to give me a chance, I promise you I'll work harder than I've ever worked in my life. I'll learn whatever I need to learn." Isaac nodded slowly, seeming to come to a decision. "All right then. The job is yours. I'll pay you $20 a month plus room and board. You'll have your own room in the house, separate from mine. I'll expect you to keep the house clean, do the washing, and prepare 3 meals a day. I've got 2 ranch hands, Miguel and his son Carlos, who live in the bunkhouse. They usually eat dinner with me. I'll give you a week to get your bearings before I start expecting regular meals." "Fair enough. More than fair," Rose said, relief flooding through her. "Thank you, Mr. Richardson. You won't regret this. Call me Isaac. We don't stand much on formality out here. And I hope you're right about me not regretting it." But he said it with a slight smile that suggested he wasn't truly worried. "I've got a few more supplies to get, then we'll head out to the ranch. You have belongings to collect, just a trunk and a carpet bag at the boarding house. We'll pick them up on the way out of town." An hour later, Rose found herself seated on a wagon next to Isaac, her belongings loaded in the back, watching Holbrook recede behind them as they traveled west along a rough dirt road. The landscape was unlike anything she had known in Pennsylvania, all rust-colored earth and scrubby vegetation, distant mesas rising against an impossibly blue sky. "It's different from what you're used to," Isaac observed, not quite a question. "Completely different, but beautiful in its own way. Most people from back east don't see it that way at first, they just see the emptiness." "There's a kind of freedom in emptiness," Rose said thoughtfully. "Room to breathe." In Philadelphia, everything felt closed in, like the buildings and the society and the expectations were all pressing down until you couldn't move without bumping into some rule or another. Isaac glanced at her with interest. "You running from something specific, or just life in general?" Rose considered how much to tell him. "My father died 2 years ago. He left debts I didn't know about. His business partner claimed I owed him nearly everything we had. He offered to forgive the debt if I married him. He was 53 years old and had already buried 2 wives. I couldn't do it, so I sold what little jewelry I had, answered Samuel Morton's advertisement, and used the money for the train ticket west. That partner have any legal claim on you? I don't think so, but I wasn't going to stay and find out. Isaac was quiet for a moment, his hands steady on the reins. "Well, you're safe out here. Man like that wouldn't last a day in this country. Too soft." There was something comforting about his certainty, about the implied protection in his words. Rose settled back against the wagon seat, letting the rhythmic movement and the warm sun ease some of the tension she had been carrying for months. The ranch, when it came into view about an hour later, exceeded Rose's expectations. The house was a solid structure of adobe and wood, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and one side. There was a barn, several corrals with horses visible inside, a bunkhouse, and various other outbuildings she couldn't immediately identify. Everything looked well-maintained, prosperous. Whatever else Isaac Richardson might be, he was clearly a successful rancher. Isaac pulled the wagon up to the house and helped Rose down before retrieving her trunk. "I'll show you around, then let you get settled. Miguel and Carlos are out checking the north fence line, so you won't meet them until dinner time." The inside of the house was spacious and well-built, with real glass windows and wood floors, though Isaac hadn't been exaggerating about the state of things. Dishes were piled in the kitchen basin. Dust covered most surfaces, and there was a general air of neglect that spoke to weeks of a busy man living alone. Isaac showed her through the main room with its large stone fireplace, the kitchen with its iron stove and work table, and then down a short hallway to 2 bedrooms. "This one's yours," he said, pushing open a door to reveal a modest room with a bed, a dresser, a washstand, and a window overlooking the front yard. "It's not fancy, but it's clean and the roof doesn't leak. My mother used to use it as a sewing room before she got too sick to do much of anything." "It's perfect," Rose said honestly. After her anxiety about where she would sleep and how she would survive, this room represented security and safety. "Thank you." Isaac set her trunk down at the foot of the bed. "I'll let you unpack and rest a bit. It's been a long couple of days for you. There's water in the kitchen if you're thirsty, and help yourself to anything you find to eat, though I'll warn you, the pickings are slim. I usually eat in town when I go in for supplies." After he left, Rose sat on the edge of the bed and looked around her new room, her new life. She had done it. She had escaped Philadelphia, survived the shock of Samuel Morton's death, and found herself a position that would at least keep her fed and housed. Now all she had to do was figure out how to actually fulfill the duties of a housekeeper, despite having no idea how to do any of them. She spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking her few belongings and then, determined to make a good start, ventured into the kitchen to assess the situation. The iron stove was intimidating, a beast of cast iron and mysterious compartments. She had watched servants cook, of course, but watching and doing were entirely different things. Still, Isaac had said he'd give her a week to get her bearings. She had time to figure this out. She started with the dishes, hauling water from the pump outside and heating it on the stove after several failed attempts to get the fire started properly. By the time she had the dishes washed and stacked on the shelves, her back ached and her hands were red and raw. It was more physical work than she'd ever done, but there was a certain satisfaction in seeing the results of her labor. She was attempting to figure out how to make coffee when she heard the front door open and male voices in the main room. Isaac appeared in the kitchen doorway, followed by 2 men Rose assumed were Miguel and Carlos. Miguel was perhaps 50, weathered and sturdy, with kind eyes and gray threading through his dark hair. Carlos looked to be in his early 20s, tall like his father with an easy smile. "Miss Zimmerman, I'd like you to meet my ranch hands, Miguel and Carlos Herrera. They've been with me since I started building this place. Miguel, Carlos, this is Rose Zimmerman. She's agreed to be our new housekeeper." "Pleased to meet you, Miss Zimmerman," Miguel said with a slight accent, removing his hat respectfully. Carlos echoed the greeting, his eyes curious but polite. "Please call me Rose," she said, wiping her damp hands on her skirt. "I hope you're not too hungry." "I'm afraid I'm still learning my way around the kitchen." "We've been eating Isaac's cooking for weeks," Carlos said with a grin. "Anything would be an improvement." "I resent that," Isaac said, but he was smiling. "My beans are perfectly adequate." "Your beans could be used to repair the barn wall," Miguel said dryly, and they all laughed. Rose felt herself relax slightly. These were good men, she could tell. Men who joked easily, who had respect and affection for each other. She had landed in a better situation than she dared to hope. "I was trying to make coffee," she admitted, "but I'm not entirely sure I've done it correctly." Isaac moved past her to inspect the coffee pot on the stove. "You've got the water in there, which is a start. You need to add the grounds." He reached for a tin on a high shelf, measured out coffee into the pot with practiced ease, and set it back on the stove. "Let it boil for a few minutes, then pour it through a cloth to strain out the grounds. Simple enough." "I'll get the hang of it," Rose said, watching carefully so she could replicate the process next time. "I know you will," Isaac said, and there was an unexpected warmth in his voice that made Rose look at him more closely. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something thoughtful and assessing but not unkind. That evening, Rose cobbled together a meal from what she could find in the pantry. Bread that was only slightly stale, some preserves, dried meat, and canned peaches. It wasn't much, but Isaac and the Herreras ate without complaint, keeping up a steady conversation about the ranch, the cattle, plans for the upcoming week. Rose mostly listened, learning the rhythm of their lives, the concerns and challenges of running a ranch in this harsh country. After dinner, Miguel and Carlos retired to the bunkhouse, and Isaac helped Rose clean up the dishes, an act of consideration she hadn't expected. They worked in companionable silence for a while before Isaac spoke. "You did fine today. I know it's all new and probably overwhelming." "I cleaned some dishes," Rose said with a self-deprecating smile. "Hardly an overwhelming achievement. You kept your composure in a difficult situation. You didn't complain or make excuses. That matters more than whether you can cook a perfect meal right off." Rose paused in her scrubbing, touched by his words. "Thank you for taking a chance on me. I meant what I said. I'll work hard." "I believe you." Isaac dried the last dish and set it aside. "Tomorrow, if you're up for it, I'll show you how to use the stove properly and we'll go over some basics for cooking. I'm not any kind of expert, but I know enough to keep from starving. Between the two of us, we ought to be able to figure things out." "You'd teach me?" Rose asked, surprised. Most men she'd known would have expected a woman to simply know how to do domestic tasks, or would have been dismissive of any woman who didn't. Why not? I had to learn from someone too. My mother taught me after my father died, said I needed to be self-sufficient. Turned out she was right. Isaac leaned against the counter, his arms crossed loosely over his chest. "That's one thing about life out here. You can't afford to be too proud or too rigid about who does what. Everybody does what needs doing." "I like that philosophy," Rose said quietly. "The world I came from had so many rules about what was proper for whom. It got suffocating." "No suffocating allowed on this ranch," Isaac said with a slight smile. "Just honest work and the freedom to be who you are." That night, lying in her narrow bed and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the desert through her window, Rose reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. A week ago, she had been preparing to marry a stranger. Now she was working for a different stranger, learning to keep house on a remote ranch in Arizona territory. But somehow, despite all the uncertainty, she felt a sense of rightness about this place, about Isaac Richardson and his quiet kindness and his willingness to teach her what she needed to know. She thought she might actually be able to build a life here, to become the person she needed to be. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. The next morning, true to his word, Isaac took time before heading out to work with the cattle to show Rose the fundamentals of working the stove and preparing basic meals. He was patient and thorough, demonstrating how to regulate the heat by adjusting the dampers, how to know when the oven was hot enough for baking, how to fry eggs and bacon without burning them. "The trick is to pay attention," he explained as they worked together in the kitchen, early morning light streaming through the windows. "Cooking's mostly about timing and temperature. Once you understand how things react to heat, the rest is just following instructions." Rose watched his hands as he worked, noting how confident and capable they were, whether he was handling a cast iron skillet or cracking eggs. She tried to replicate his movements, her own attempts clumsy at first, improving slightly with practice. "I'm going to burn everything for the first month," she predicted ruefully after her second batch of eggs came out overdone. "Probably," Isaac agreed cheerfully. "I sure did, but we won't starve and that's what matters. Here, try again. This time, pull the pan off the heat just before the eggs look done. They'll keep cooking from their own heat." By the time breakfast was ready, Rose had managed to produce eggs that were only slightly rubbery and bacon that was mostly evenly cooked. Miguel and Carlos joined them, complimenting Rose's efforts with sincerity that warmed her heart. After the meal, Isaac headed out with the Herreras to move cattle to a different grazing area, leaving Rose alone with the house and her determination to master it. She spent the morning sweeping and dusting, finding a strange satisfaction in bringing order to neglected spaces. The work was physically demanding, but her body would adjust. What she enjoyed was the immediate visible result, the way a room looked different after she'd cleaned it, proof of her effort and progress. In the afternoon, she tackled laundry, a process that proved far more complicated than she'd anticipated. She had to haul water, heat it in large pots on the stove, scrub the clothes against a washboard until her arms ached, wring them out, and hang them on lines strung between posts in the yard. By the time she finished with just the first load, her back was screaming and her hands were raw, but the sight of clean clothes drying in the Arizona sun filled her with pride. Isaac returned as evening approached, dusty and tired, his shirt stained with sweat. He stopped when he saw the clothes hanging on the line, a smile crossing his face. "You've been busy." "I may never be able to lift my arms again, but at least we'll have clean clothes," Rose said, flexing her aching shoulders. "It gets easier," Isaac assured her. "Your body gets used to it. Come on inside. I'll help you figure out dinner." They worked together again, Isaac guiding Rose through the process of making a simple beef stew with vegetables from the root cellar. She chopped vegetables while he browned the meat, and they talked as they worked, the conversation flowing easily from one topic to another. Isaac told her about the ranch, how he'd come to Arizona Territory 5 years ago with almost nothing and slowly built up his herd, acquired his land, made something substantial from raw opportunity and hard work. "My mother came out with me," he said as he stirred the stew. "She was already sick, but she wanted to see me get established before she died. She lasted 3 years, long enough to see this place become something real. I think she died satisfied knowing I'd be all right. You must miss her," Rose said gently. "Every day. She was tough as old leather but had the kindest heart of anyone I've ever known. You would have liked her." "I'm sure I would have." Isaac glanced at her, something shifting in his expression. "She'd like you too. She always said the best people are the ones willing to admit they don't know everything, willing to learn." "Then I must be very best indeed," Rose said with a self-deprecating smile, "because I don't know much of anything." "You know more than you think," Isaac said quietly. "You've got courage and determination. That counts for a lot more than knowing how to make a perfect pie crust." The compliment caught Rose off guard, warming something deep in her chest. She wasn't used to being valued for qualities beyond her appearance or her social graces. Isaac saw her as capable, as strong, even as she struggled with tasks most frontier women could do in their sleep. It made her want to live up to his faith in her. Over the following weeks, a routine developed. Isaac would wake early and work with Rose in the kitchen, before heading out to the day's ranch work. Miguel and Carlos would join them for breakfast and dinner, the meals gradually improving as Rose's skills developed through trial and error and Isaac's patient instruction. The days were long and physically demanding, but Rose found herself adapting, her soft hands developing calluses, her body growing stronger, her movements in the kitchen becoming more confident. She burned things, oversalted things, occasionally produced meals that were barely edible, but no one complained. Isaac and the Herreras ate whatever she made with good humor, offering suggestions when asked but never criticism. Miguel's wife had died years ago, and he had learned to cook out of necessity. So sometimes he would show Rose tricks his wife had taught him, little techniques for making beans more flavorful or biscuits lighter. But it was with Isaac that Rose spent the most time, their interactions developing a comfortable intimacy that came from working side by side day after day. He taught her how to ride so she wouldn't be completely isolated if she needed to go somewhere while he was working. She learned to saddle a horse to sit properly, to guide the animal with subtle movements. Isaac was patient with her fear at first, staying close, ready to help if she needed it. One afternoon, about a month after her arrival, they rode out together to check on a water source for the cattle, Isaac wanting to make sure it hadn't dried up in the ongoing heat. The ride took them through beautiful desert country, past towering rock formations and scattered juniper trees. Rose was beginning to feel confident in the saddle, no longer gripping with white-knuckled terror at every movement. "You're a natural," Isaac observed as they let the horses walk at an easy pace. "Took me months to look that comfortable on horseback." "I think you're being generous, but I appreciate it," Rose said, pleased nonetheless. "I never imagined I'd learn to ride. Ladies in Philadelphia don't generally go galloping about the countryside. They're lost. Some of the best thinking I've ever done has been on horseback." They reached the water source, a natural spring that fed into a small pool surrounded by green vegetation, an oasis in the arid landscape. Isaac dismounted and walked around the area, checking the flow, looking for any signs of problems. Rose stayed on her horse, content to watch him work, to observe the capable way he moved, how attuned he was to every detail of his land. She had been trying not to notice how attractive he was, how her heart beat faster when he smiled at her, how she found herself watching for his return each evening. It seemed dangerous to develop feelings for her employer, for a man who had hired her out of kindness and was simply being helpful by teaching her what she needed to know. Surely he saw her as a responsibility, nothing more. But sometimes she caught him looking at her with an expression that suggested his thoughts might not be entirely employer-like. Sometimes their hands would brush as they worked together in the kitchen, and the contact would linger a moment longer than necessary. Sometimes he would say something that felt like more than casual conversation, words weighted with meaning she wasn't quite sure how to interpret. "Everything looks good here," Isaac said, returning to his horse. "Water's still flowing strong." He paused, shading his eyes to look at the sky. "We've got time before we need to head back. Want to rest for a bit. The horses could use a break. They sat in the shade of a large boulder near the spring, the horses grazing nearby. The quiet was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the scrubby vegetation and the occasional call of a bird. Rose found herself relaxing completely, the tension she still sometimes carried from her old life draining away in the peaceful stillness. "Can I ask you something?" Isaac said after a while, "Of course. Do you ever regret coming out here? Ever wish you'd stayed in Philadelphia, tried to work things out some other way?" Rose considered the question seriously. "No," she said finally. "I won't pretend it hasn't been hard, learning everything from scratch, being so far from anything familiar. But I feel more alive here than I ever did back east. I feel like I'm becoming someone real, someone useful. In Philadelphia, I was just decorative, like a vase on a shelf. Here, I matter." "You always mattered," Isaac said, his voice low and intense. "Whether you can cook or sew or any of that. You matter because you're you, Rose. Because you're brave and honest and you don't give up even when things are difficult." Rose turned to look at him, her breath catching at the expression on his face. There was no mistaking it now. Whatever she had been trying not to feel, trying not to hope for, was reflected back at her in his eyes. "Isaac," she said softly, not even sure what she was asking. "I know I'm probably overstepping," he said, not looking away. "You work for me, and I've got no right to complicate things. But I need you to know that somewhere along the way, watching you tackle every new challenge with determination, watching you become part of this place, part of my life, I've developed feelings for you that go well beyond employer and employee." Rose's heart was racing now, her whole body warm despite the shade. "You're not overstepping," she managed to say, "because I feel the same way." The smile that crossed Isaac's face was like the sun coming out bright and transforming. "Yeah." "Yeah," Rose confirmed, finding herself smiling back just as widely. Isaac reached out slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull back if she wanted to, and took her hand in his. His palm was calloused, warm, solid. "I've been trying to figure out how to tell you for weeks now. Didn't want to scare you off or make you feel like you had to return my feelings to keep your position. My position has nothing to do with how I feel about you," Rose said firmly. "I care about you because you're kind and patient and you make me laugh. Because you took a chance on me when you had no reason to. Because you treat me like an equal, like someone capable of learning and growing. Because when I'm with you, I feel safe and valued and seen." Isaac lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "I'm going to court you properly," he said. "I want to do this right. I want you to be sure." "I'm already sure," Rose said, but she was touched by his insistence on propriety. "But I'm happy to be courted." They rode back to the ranch in the golden light of late afternoon, their horses side by side, their hands clasped between them. Rose felt as if she were floating, as if the world had suddenly become brighter and more full of possibility. She had come west expecting one kind of marriage, and instead had found something infinitely better, something built on genuine feeling and mutual respect. Over the following weeks, Isaac courted her with a sweetness that made her heart ache. He brought her wildflowers he found while working, small bouquets of desert blooms that she arranged in a jar on the kitchen table. He taught her to shoot, patient through her initial terrible aim, until she could at least hit the general area of a target. He took her on evening rides to watch the sunset paint the desert in impossible shades of orange and red and purple. They still worked together in the kitchen, but now the domesticity of it felt different, charged with new meaning. Isaac would stand behind her as she learned to knead bread dough, his hands covering hers, guiding her movements. Rose would catch him watching her as she went about her tasks, his expression soft and full of affection. They talked about everything, Long conversations that stretched into the night, sitting on the porch under a sky full of stars, learning each other's histories and dreams and fears. "I want children someday," Isaac told her one night, his arm around her shoulders as they sat on the porch steps. "Not right away necessarily, but eventually. A whole houseful of them, growing up out here with space to run and explore." "I'd like that too," Rose said, leaning into his warmth. "I always wanted siblings growing up, but it was just me. I'd love to have a big family." "Good," Isaac said, kissing the top of her head. "Because I'm going to marry you, Rose Zimmerman, soon as you'll have me." Rose's breath caught. "Is that a proposal?" "A warning of a proposal," Isaac said with a smile in his voice. "Giving you time to prepare yourself." "But yes, I'm going to ask you properly, with a ring and everything. I'm just telling you now so you know my intentions are serious." "I know your intentions are serious," Rose said, turning in his arms to face him. "And my answer is already yes, whenever you decide to ask officially." Isaac kissed her then, sweet and deep, his hand cradling her face with such tenderness that Rose felt tears prick her eyes. This was nothing like the cold arranged marriage she had been traveling toward when she first arrived in Holbrook. This was real and warm and right, built on friendship and mutual support and genuine love. 2 weeks later, Isaac asked her officially, presenting her with a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother. They were in the kitchen, of all places, Rose up to her elbows in bread dough, flour dusting her nose. Isaac came in from the morning's work, saw her there, covered in flour and completely intent on what she was doing, and apparently couldn't wait another moment. "Marry me," he said, pulling the ring from his pocket. "I know I said I'd make it romantic, take you somewhere special, but I can't wait. Marry me, Rose, be my wife, be my partner, build this life with me." Rose abandoned her bread dough without a second thought, wiping her hands hastily on her apron. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, absolutely yes." The ring slid onto her finger perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Isaac pulled her into his arms, kissing her thoroughly, neither of them caring about the flour now covering them both. They were married a month later in a simple ceremony in Holbrook's small church, with Miguel and Carlos as witnesses, and what seemed like the entire town in attendance, curious to see the mail-order bride who had ended up marrying Isaac Richardson, instead of poor Sam Morton. Rose wore a simple dress of pale blue that she and Lucy had worked on together, Lucy proving to be surprisingly skilled with a needle. Isaac wore his best suit, his hair freshly cut, looking nervous and happy in equal measure. "I cannot cook or sew," Rose confessed to him just before the ceremony, a callback to that first honest conversation they'd had in the general store. She wanted him to remember what he was getting, even though she'd improved considerably in the cooking department. The sewing was still hopeless. Isaac laughed, pulling her close despite the scandalized looks from some of the older ladies waiting for the ceremony to begin. "Then we'll learn everything together," he said. "That's what marriage is anyway, learning and growing together. I don't need you to be perfect at domestic tasks, Rose. I just need you to be you." The ceremony was short and sweet, the words traditional but feeling entirely new as Rose and Isaac spoke their vows to each other. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Isaac kissed her with such enthusiasm that the assembled guests laughed and applauded. They celebrated with a simple dinner at the boarding house, Mrs. Patterson having insisted on preparing a wedding feast. It wasn't fancy, but it was full of warmth and good wishes from the community that had welcomed Rose and now celebrated her happiness. That night, they returned to the ranch as husband and wife. Isaac carried her over the threshold of the house that was now fully theirs, both of them laughing, giddy with joy and the relief of having finally made their union official. They had agreed to move Isaac's belongings into what had been Rose's room, making it their shared bedroom, and leaving Isaac's larger room for the future nursery they both hoped to fill someday. The next morning, Rose woke wrapped in Isaac's arms, sunlight streaming through the window, feeling more content than she'd ever imagined possible. She had traveled west to marry a stranger, and instead had found love with a man who valued her for who she truly was, who had been patient and kind as she learned to navigate frontier life, who wanted to build a future with her based on mutual respect and genuine partnership. Isaac stirred, pulling her closer, kissing her shoulder. "Good morning, Mrs. Richardson." "Good morning, Mr. Richardson," Rose replied, loving the sound of her new name, ready to face another day of figuring things out together, always. Their marriage settled into a comfortable rhythm. Rose continued to improve her domestic skills, though she never became the kind of effortlessly competent homemaker that other ranch wives seemed to be. She could cook a decent meal now, keep the house reasonably clean, manage the household accounts with ease given her education. But she still sometimes burned things, still couldn't sew more than a basic straight seam, still occasionally felt overwhelmed by the sheer physical demands of frontier life. Isaac never minded. He continued to help her when she needed it, jumping in to assist with particularly heavy tasks, taking over cooking on days when Rose was exhausted or not feeling well. He treated their marriage as a true partnership, neither of them rigidly bound to particular roles, both of them doing whatever needed doing. Miguel and Carlos continued to work the ranch, and over time they became like family. Carlos eventually married a girl from town, a sweet young woman named Maria who became Rose's first real female friend in Arizona. Miguel remained a steady, reliable presence, his quiet wisdom helping guide them all through the challenges that arose on the ranch. 6 months into their marriage, Rose realized she was pregnant. She told Isaac one evening after dinner, nervous despite knowing how much he wanted children. His reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He swept her into his arms, spinning her around despite her laughing protests to be careful, his face alight with pure joy. "We're having a baby," he kept repeating, as if he couldn't quite believe it. "We're actually having a baby." The pregnancy was not easy. Rose suffered from terrible morning sickness for the first few months, barely able to keep food down, weak and miserable. Isaac hovered, worried and attentive, taking over most of her usual tasks, bringing her tea and dry toast, sitting with her during the worst spells. Lucy came out from town regularly to check on her, offering advice and practical help. As her pregnancy progressed and the sickness faded, Rose bloomed. She loved feeling the baby move inside her, loved watching her body change to accommodate new life. Isaac was fascinated by every aspect of it, his hand constantly on her growing belly, talking to their child, making plans for the future. "What if I'm terrible at being a mother?" Rose asked him one night as they lay in bed, her fears surfacing. "I had no training for it. I barely know how to take care of myself, let alone a helpless infant." "You'll learn, same as you learned everything else," Isaac said confidently, his hand spread across her stomach. "You'll figure it out, we both will, and we won't be alone. Miguel and Carlos will help, Lucy will help, Mrs. Patterson from town has already told me she'll come out for the birth and stay a few weeks after to help. We'll have all the support we need." He was right. When Rose went into labor on a cool November night in 1883, she was surrounded by helping hands. Lucy had come to stay a week earlier, not wanting to risk missing the birth. Mrs. Patterson arrived with the son the next morning, experienced and capable, guiding Rose through the long, difficult process of bringing new life into the world. Isaac stayed close, holding her hand, offering water and encouragement, his face pale with worry but his voice steady. Their son was born just after sunset, arriving with a lusty cry that seemed to announce his determination to be heard. He was perfect, with a shock of dark hair like his father and eyes that Rose was certain would eventually turn the same gray-blue. Isaac held him with such tender care, such obvious love, that Rose fell in love with her husband all over again. "What should we name him?" Isaac asked, sitting on the edge of the bed, their son cradled carefully in his arms. They had discussed names but never settled on anything definite. Looking at her husband and son now, Rose said, "What about Thomas, after your father?" Isaac's eyes grew bright with unshed tears. "You do that." "He gave me you," Rose said simply. "That's worth honoring." "Thomas Richardson," Isaac said, testing the name. "I like it, Tommy for short." The baby, as if approving of his name, made a small sound and waved one tiny fist. They both laughed, exhausted and elated and overwhelmed by the enormity of what they'd just done. True to his word, Isaac was a full partner in parenting. He changed diapers without complaint, walked the floor with Tommy during the long, sleepless nights, learned to soothe the baby when Rose was exhausted beyond measure. They figured it out together, making mistakes and learning from them, supporting each other through the difficult early months. Rose had worried she wouldn't know how to be a mother, but she found that love made up for a lot of inexperience. She learned to nurse, to bathe, to interpret Tommy's different cries. Isaac learned right alongside her, neither of them claiming expertise, both of them committed to doing their best. As Tommy grew from infant to toddler, the ranch prospered. Isaac's cattle operation continued to expand, his reputation for quality stock growing throughout the territory. Rose managed the household with increasing confidence, though she still relied on Isaac's help more than most wives probably did. She didn't mind. She liked working with him, liked the partnership they'd built where neither of them had to be perfect or all-knowing. When Tommy was 2, Rose became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to expect. Their daughter was born on a beautiful spring morning in 1886, smaller than Tommy had been but just as healthy. They named her Sarah, after Isaac's mother, continuing the tradition of honoring their family. With 2 children, life became even more busy and chaotic. The house was full of noise and activity, baby giggles and toddler tantrums, the constant demands of small children. Rose was exhausted most of the time, but it was a good exhaustion, the kind that came from a full life rather than empty drudgery. Isaac was devoted to both children, spending every spare moment with them. He took Tommy out to help with ranch chores as soon as the boy was old enough to toddle around safely, teaching him about the animals and the land. He was gentle and patient with Sarah, content to sit and play simple games with her, to let her fall asleep on his chest while he read or did paperwork. "You're a wonderful father," Rose told him one evening, watching him carefully stack blocks with Sarah while Tommy helped by occasionally knocking them down. "I had a good example," Isaac said, steadying the tower as Tommy reached for it again. "And I have a good partner." That makes all the difference. As the years passed, their family continued to grow. Another son, James, arrived when Sarah was 2. Then 2 years after that, twin girls, Emma and Grace, who kept everyone constantly busy with their mischievous energy. 5 children in 7 years was exhausting and overwhelming, and more wonderful than Rose had ever imagined. The house expanded to accommodate the growing family. Isaac adding rooms over several years, until the original modest structure had become a sprawling home full of life and love and constant activity. Miguel retired from active ranch work but stayed on, living in a small house Isaac built for him near the main house, serving as an honorary grandfather to the children. Carlos and Maria had children of their own, creating a whole new generation growing up on the ranch. Through it all, Rose and Isaac remained each other's anchor and support. They still worked together in the kitchen when they could, though Rose had finally become competent enough to handle most meals on her own. She never did learn to sew well, that particular domestic skill permanently beyond her abilities. Isaac didn't care. He had married her for who she was, not for her housekeeping skills, and that had never changed. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Isaac surprised Rose by arranging for all 5 children to stay with Miguel and Maria for the night so he could take his wife on an overnight trip to Holbrook. They checked into the boarding house, Mrs. Patterson delighted to see them, and enjoyed a rare evening alone, dining at the restaurant, taking a walk through the town that had grown considerably in the decade since Rose had first arrived. You ever think about what your life would have been like if Sam Morton hadn't died? Isaac asked as they walked hand in hand down the main street in the twilight. Sometimes, Rose admitted. It would have been so different. Probably fine, Sam was supposed to be a good man, but it wouldn't have been this. It wouldn't have been you. I'm glad you ended up on my ranch, Isaac said, stopping to face her, taking both her hands in his. I'm glad you were brave enough to tell the truth about not knowing how to cook or sew. I'm glad we built this life together. So am I, Rose said, reaching up to kiss him. So am I. When they returned to the ranch the next day, they were greeted by chaos. Tommy, now 9, had apparently attempted to cook breakfast for his younger siblings with predictably disastrous results. The kitchen was a disaster. There was egg on the ceiling somehow, and Sarah was crying because she'd burned her finger on the stove. But as Rose waded into the mess to assess the damage and comfort Sarah, while Isaac dealt with the state of the kitchen and gently scolded Tommy for attempting something dangerous without supervision, she found herself smiling. This was her life. Messy, imperfect, sometimes overwhelming, but utterly full of love. She had traveled west expecting to become someone she wasn't, to mold herself into the shape of a frontier wife. Instead, she'd found a man who let her be exactly who she was, who built a life with her based on mutual learning and support and genuine partnership. As the years continued to pass, their children grew and changed. Tommy developed into a serious, responsible boy who loved the ranch and clearly intended to follow in his father's footsteps. Sarah was gentle and artistic, always drawing or making up elaborate stories. James was adventurous and bold, constantly getting into scrapes that made Rose's heart stop. The twins, Emma and Grace, were inseparable and endlessly creative in finding new ways to cause havoc. Isaac taught all of them to ride, to work cattle, to respect the land and the animals. Rose taught them to read and write and do arithmetic, conducting informal lessons at the kitchen table. Neither parent pushed rigid gender roles on their children. The girls learned to ride and rope just like their brothers. The boys learned to cook basic meals and help with household tasks. Isaac and Rose wanted to raise children who were capable and self-sufficient, who could adapt to whatever life threw at them. When Tommy turned 18 in 1901, Isaac officially made him a partner in the ranch operation. The boy had earned it through years of hard work and demonstrated commitment. Carlos had long since become the ranch foreman, and together the 3 of them managed an operation that had grown to be one of the most successful in the territory. Sarah, at 16, had started writing stories and submitting them to magazines back east under a pen name. When she sold her first story, the whole family celebrated with a special dinner. Rose was so proud she cried, seeing her daughter pursue something creative despite the practical demands of frontier life. James, at 14, was talking about eventually joining the cavalry, drawn to adventure and service. The twins, just turned 12, were currently obsessed with horses and spent every possible moment at the stable. "We did good," Isaac told Rose one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in familiar gorgeous shades. They were in their early 40s now, their hair starting to show gray, their bodies showing the wear of hard work and years, but still healthy and strong. "We did very good," Rose agreed, lacing her fingers through his. "I never imagined my life could be this full, this happy." "Neither did I," Isaac said. "I thought I'd end up a lonely old rancher, slowly building something impressive but coming home to an empty house." "And then you walked into the general store, all honesty and desperation, and changed everything." "You changed everything," Rose corrected. "You took a chance on me. You taught me what I needed to know. You treated me like a partner instead of a servant or an ornament. You made me believe I could be more than I was." "You always were more than you thought," Isaac said, bringing her hand to his lips. "I just helped you see it." They sat in comfortable silence as the light faded, surrounded by the sounds of their land, their home, their life. Inside the house, they could hear their children talking and laughing, the normal sounds of a family at ease with each other. As Arizona moved toward statehood, as the wild frontier gradually transformed into something more settled and civilized, Isaac and Rose's ranch remained a constant. It was a place of hard work and love, of learning and growing, of family and partnership. The original simple house had expanded into a rambling home full of memories. The modest cattle operation had become a significant enterprise. But at the heart of it, all remained the same two people who had started with honesty and mutual respect, and built something beautiful together. Years later, when they had grandchildren running through the house, and Tommy was managing most of the ranch operations while Isaac gradually stepped back, Rose would sometimes think about that day in the general store when she'd been desperate and afraid, when she'd made the choice to tell the truth instead of lying about her capabilities. It had been the best decision of her life, because it had led her to Isaac, to this family, to this life that was so much richer and fuller than anything she'd imagined possible. She'd come west to escape, but she'd found something far more valuable than mere escape. She'd found home. She'd found love. She'd found herself. And through it all, the memory of Isaac's response to her confession remained one of her most treasured moments. "I cannot cook or sew," she had said, terrified he would turn her away. And he had laughed, not with mockery but with understanding and acceptance, and said, "Then we'll learn everything together." They had kept that promise. Through more than 3 decades of marriage, through 5 children and eventually dozens of grandchildren, through the challenges and joys and mundane daily work of building a life together, they had learned everything together. Neither of them had been perfect. Both of them had made mistakes, had struggled, had faced moments of doubt and difficulty. But they had faced it all as partners, as equals, as two people committed to growing together rather than expecting perfection from each other. In 1918, when Isaac was 64 and Rose 62, they celebrated their 35th wedding anniversary with a huge gathering at the ranch. All 5 of their children came, along with their spouses and children. Carlos and Maria were there, their own large family in attendance. Friends from Holbrook and the surrounding ranches came to celebrate with them. The house overflowed with people and noise and love. Tommy, now married with 4 children of his own, stood to make a toast. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass. who taught us that partnership means learning together, growing together, and supporting each other through everything life brings. Who showed us that love isn't about perfection, it's about showing up every day and doing your best. Happy anniversary. Everyone cheered and drank, and Rose found herself crying happy tears as Isaac pulled her close and kissed her temple. 35 years, he said wonderingly. It's gone by in a blink. And I'd do it all again, Rose said firmly. Every single moment. Even the burned dinners and the disastrous first attempts at laundry. Especially those, Rose said with a laugh. They led to you teaching me, to us working together. Some of my best memories are of us figuring things out side by side in that kitchen. As the party continued around them, as their children and grandchildren filled the house with life and celebration, Isaac and Rose slipped away for a few moments of quiet on the porch, their special spot where they'd spent countless evenings over the years. I love you, Isaac said, taking her hand. Just as much now as I did the day we married. Maybe more, because now I know every part of you, all the ways you're strong and capable and amazing. I love you too, Rose said, leaning against his shoulder. Thank you for taking a chance on a city girl who didn't know anything about frontier life. Thank you for being patient. Thank you for building this beautiful life with me. Thank you for being brave enough to tell the truth that day in the general store, Isaac replied. Thank you for being willing to learn. Thank you for being exactly who you are. They sat together as the sun set over the land they'd built their life on, surrounded by family and love and the evidence of 35 years of partnership. Rose thought about the frightened young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Holbrook in 1882, desperate and uncertain, and felt proud of how far she'd come, how much she'd grown. She hadn't needed to pretend to be someone she wasn't. She hadn't needed to arrive already knowing everything. She just needed to be honest, to be willing to learn, and to find a partner who valued those qualities more than superficial competence. In Isaac, she'd found not just a husband but a true partner, someone who had walked beside her through every challenge, who had celebrated every triumph, who had made their marriage a true partnership in every sense of the word. As darkness fell and they finally returned to rejoin their party, Rose squeezed Isaac's hand and thought about the words that had started everything, the confession that had changed her life. I cannot cook or sew, she had said, terrified and honest. And Isaac had laughed and promised, then we'll learn everything together. They had kept that promise for 35 years and counting, and if Rose had any say in it, they'd keep learning together for many years to come, because that was what love was, really. Not some instantaneous perfect match, but a conscious choice to grow together, to support each other, to face life's challenges as partners. And there was no one Rose would rather learn with, grow with, and live with than Isaac Richardson, the rancher who had taken a chance on her and helped her become more than she'd ever dreamed possible. The years continued to pass gently. Isaac and Rose remained healthy and active well into their later years, though they gradually handed over more responsibility to their children. Tommy ran the ranch with quiet competence, his own children already learning the business. Sarah had become a published author, her novels and stories gaining modest success. James had indeed joined the cavalry and now worked as a sheriff in a nearby town. The twins had married brothers from a neighboring ranch and lived close enough to visit regularly. The house remained full of life, with grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren running through its rooms. Rose finally admitted she was too old to handle all the cooking and hired help, which Isaac thought was hilarious given how resistant she'd been to the idea for years. I worked so hard to learn how to cook. I feel like I'm giving up, she'd protested. and Isaac had kissed her and reminded her that knowing when to accept help was also a valuable skill they'd learned together. In 1925, they celebrated their 42nd wedding anniversary quietly, just the two of them, taking a ride out to the water source where Isaac had first confessed his feelings all those decades ago. They moved more slowly now, their bodies showing the years, but the land was still beautiful, and being together was still the greatest comfort either of them knew. "You know what I'm most proud of?" Rose asked as they sat in the shade, the horses grazing nearby, the desert stretched out around them. "What's that?" "That we built something that lasted. Not just our marriage, though I'm proud of that too, but this whole life. The ranch, the family, the example we set for our children. We took two people who didn't know what they were doing and created something beautiful and lasting." "We did," Isaac agreed. "And we're still learning even now. Learning how to grow old together. Learning how to let go and let our children take over. Learning how to be grandparents and great-grandparents. Always learning together," Rose said with a smile, echoing the promise that had defined their marriage. Isaac lived to see his 75th birthday, still sharp and engaged with life until the very end. When he passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1929, Rose held his hand and whispered her love, grateful that he hadn't suffered, heartbroken at the loss of her partner of 46 years. The funeral brought the entire community together. Isaac had been respected and loved, known for his fairness, his kindness, his willingness to help neighbors in need. Rose sat surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, an entire family that existed because Isaac Richardson had once taken a chance on a desperate young woman who couldn't cook or sew. After the funeral, after the guests had departed and the house had grown quiet, Rose's children worried about her, about how she would handle living alone after nearly 5 decades of partnership. But Rose surprised them with her resilience. She grieved deeply, missing Isaac with an ache that never fully went away, but she didn't crumble. Isaac had taught her to be strong, to be capable, to face challenges head-on. She honored his memory by continuing to live fully. She moved into a smaller house on the ranch property that Tommy built for her, insisting she didn't need the big house anymore, and it should belong to Tommy and his family. She spent her days writing letters to her scattered children and grandchildren, reading, tending a small garden, and holding court for the constant stream of family members who visited. She told stories about the old days, about Isaac, about building the ranch, about learning to survive and thrive in the frontier. Rose lived another 12 years after Isaac's death, remaining sharp and engaged until the very end. When she passed away quietly in her sleep in 1941, at the age of 81, surrounded by photographs of her family and the life she'd built, her children found among her things a journal she'd kept throughout her years in Arizona. The first entry, dated June 1882, began, "Today I arrived in Holbrook and learned that Samuel Morton, the man I came to marry, is dead. I have no money, no skills, and no idea what I will do. I am terrified." The entries chronicled her journey from that terrified young woman to the strong, capable matriarch she became. They told of learning to cook, of falling in love with Isaac, of building a family and a life. But the entry that all her children remembered most clearly, the one that Tommy read aloud at her funeral, was dated from her wedding day in 1883. "Today I married Isaac Richardson," it read. "Just before the ceremony, I confessed to him again that I cannot cook or sew, all the things a frontier wife should know. I think I was testing him one final time, making sure he knew what he was getting. He laughed, that warm, wonderful laugh that makes me feel safe and valued, and said, 'Then we'll learn everything together.' And I knew, absolutely knew that I was marrying the right man. Not because he was perfect, but because he was willing to be imperfect with me, to learn and grow and build something together. I love him with all my heart, and I cannot wait to see what we'll learn together in all the years ahead. They had learned so much together. How to build a home, raise a family, run a successful ranch. How to support each other through loss and celebrate each other's triumphs. How to grow old together while keeping alive the spark that had drawn them to each other in the first place. How to create a legacy of love and partnership that would extend through generations. At Rose's funeral, the church in Holbrook was packed beyond capacity, filled with children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, with friends and community members whose lives she'd touched. They told stories of her kindness, her humor, her determination. They spoke of the example she and Isaac had set, of a marriage built on honesty and mutual respect and a willingness to learn together. Tommy, standing before the assembled crowd with tears streaming down his face, said simply, "My mother taught us that it's okay not to know how to do something as long as you're willing to learn. My father taught us that love means being patient while someone learns." Together, they taught us that the strongest partnerships are built not on perfection, but on showing up every day with honesty and commitment and a willingness to grow. They learned everything together, and in doing so, they taught all of us how to live and love well. Rose and Isaac were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch they'd built together, their graves marked with simple headstones that bore their names, dates, and a single shared inscription. They learned everything together. The ranch continued to thrive under Tommy's management, and eventually under his children's management. The family remained close, bound together by the example Rose and Isaac had set, and the values they'd instilled. The story of how their grandparents met, of Rose's honest confession and Isaac's laughing acceptance, became family legend, told and retold to each new generation as an example of how true partnership should look. And in the old farmhouse, now preserved as part of the ranch's history, visitors could still see the kitchen where Rose had learned to cook with Isaac's patient guidance, the porch where they'd spent countless evenings talking and planning and simply being together, the rooms that had housed 5 children and countless grandchildren. The house stood as a testament to what two people could build together when they approached life with honesty, humor, and a willingness to learn. Rose Zimmerman had boarded a stagecoach in 1882 as a desperate young woman fleeing an impossible situation. She'd arrived in Holbrook expecting one life and had built something entirely different and infinitely better. She'd found love not by pretending to be someone she wasn't, but by being brave enough to be exactly who she was. And in Isaac Richardson, she'd found a partner who valued that honesty, who had been willing to learn and grow alongside her, who had helped her become strong and capable while loving her through every stumble and failure along the way. Their love story wasn't one of instant perfect compatibility. It was messier than that, more real than that. It was a story of two imperfect people choosing each other, committing to each other, and building something beautiful through years of daily choice and effort and love. It was a story of learning together, failing together, succeeding together, and facing everything life brought as true partners. And it all started with a confession, a laugh, and a promise that would define more than 4 decades of marriage and influence generations to come. "I cannot cook or sew." "Then we'll learn everything together."